Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to Circle of Fellows for February 2022. I'm Shel Holtz. I am going to be your moderator for today's panel. Also, just as a matter of record, I am Senior Director of Communications at Webcor in San Francisco. We are a commercial general contractor and builder. But enough about that. We're going to focus on the IABC aspect of things today. And today we are talking about ESG, environment, social, and governance, and the role that communication plays and why communication should play a role in this particular rising theme in business. We have a great panel to talk about this today. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in the order I see you all on my screen, going clockwise. That would start with you, Diane.
Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Gayeski. I'm a professor of strategic communication in the Roy H. Park School of Communications at Ithaca College. And I try to practice what I preach through my firm, Gayeski Analytics, and be happy to share with you specifically what my students are thinking about all this.
We will definitely ask you what your students are thinking about all this. I'm definitely curious. Jane, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Mitchell, based in the UK. And the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years focuses on ethics and values, helping organizations to clarify their purpose, why they're doing what they're doing, and proving that they're doing what they say they're going to do. And right at the heart of that sits corporate responsibility, sustainable development goals, ESG. So it's an evolving conversation, and I hope that we'll be sharing some of those experiences with you today.
I hope so too. Rajiv, you're up now.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Rajiv Kumar and from India, and I am an independent strategic communication consultant presently. I've had work in the Tata Group for quite a decade or so, and before that I was in the Army. I've been a member of IBC for more than 2 decades, and my work in ESG is primarily right now. I've published a book called Outlast: How ESG Can Benefit Your Business. It's launched just last month through HarperCollins. So I'll be sharing some of the things that I have covered in the book in this discussion.
Happy to have you here, Rajiv, and congratulations on publication of the book. And finally, Alice.
Hi, I'm Alice Brink. I'm based in Houston. I am a communications consultant focusing on primarily the energy industry and helping leaders clarify their messages and make them persuasive. And one of the big issues in the energy industry right now, of course, is sustainability, particularly environmental sustainability. I'm excited that today we're going to be actually talking about all three aspects of ESG, because I do think that many times we tend to focus on the E and not the whole picture.
That's very true. And in fact, one of my first questions, not the first, but one of the first, is going to be around governance in particular and how that fits not only with the E and the S, but also with our role as communicator. But Rajiv, I'd like to start with you. Oh, but before I do that, I need to ask those of you who are watching in real time to please share your questions, your comments, your experiences, your observations through the chat feature on YouTube Live. They will show up right here on my control panel, and I'll be able to put them up on the screen for the panel to see, and that will give us something different to talk about than the list of questions that I have here. But Rajiv, how long, and I'm asking you because you wrote the book, man, so how long has ESG as a unified topic been a thing? We've talked about environment for a long time. Governance has always been there. Social has sort of come and gone and had different meanings. But when did they get assembled into something that was a unified theme for businesses to focus on?
It entered the lexicon about more than a decade back, but it didn't gain so much prominence But with the climate summits taking place, and the COP26 and much earlier Paris agreements, suddenly people started realizing that there are many other aspects beyond the environment also to look at. And suddenly companies were subjected to a lot of scrutiny, and there were multiple stakeholders, and companies started getting judged on these parameters. And that has forced the companies to kind of improve on their disclosures and reporting on social and environmental performance and governance also. So primarily, the if you see, it has started about 5 to 6 years ago. It has come into prominence, but right now the it's like a tsunami. It has captured the eyes and attention of all stakeholders in a big way.
What is the common thread between these three concepts? I mean, governance seems to be something that sits at the board level traditionally. Social, is in a lot of organization that gets pushed down to the operational level where teams might participate in some social activities, and then there's philanthropy. And environmental has been in a department generally that focuses on it. So what's the common thread that makes these things belong in the same bucket?
See, we always know what corporate identity is, and in corporate identity, basically we are looking at the character of an organization. And primarily, in when we look at a character, we see what it is made of. So primarily, it's a wake-up call to corporates to shape up. And when you talk of governance, that these companies should be well governed, they should be conscious of the impact that they make on the environment. At the same time, they should also be conscious of the impact the environment is having on them, because it affects their sustainability. And also, when we talk of the social side, CSR has been a concept which has been long in use. But now, when we talk of social, we are looking at many other aspects beyond just CSR. Here we are concerned about all the social impact that what the activities and behavior of a corporate has on several stakeholders. So the idea has expanded gradually to show that the character of an organization, the identity of an organization is shaped much more from its impact on the environment, and the way the environment impacts the organization. That is, use the term materiality when we talk of ESG, and its behavior is very important. How does it care for its employees? How does it care for its stakeholders? And that the US Roundtable also in 2019 shifted the primacy of the shareholder. They said that shareholders are not the primary stakeholders, but now a corporation has to be responsible towards all stakeholders. So there has been that is a very marked shift which is being recognized all over the globe, and businesses realizing that to survive, exist, and to maintain an identity, all the three parameters of ESG plus the economic dimension also has to be kept in good shape. That is how they get linked.
I think that one of the things is there's sort of a family tree of ESG, and in the U.S. it's often pointed to the Environmental Protection Agency's creation back in the 1970s, and the fact that suddenly people had to pay more attention to the environment because there were legal parameters around it. And the concept of sustainability that was established a couple of decades ago really focused on they called it the troika of people, planet, and profits. And I think that the interesting thing about the evolution of sustainability is that when we talk about ESG and reporting against ESG standards, whether the company makes a profit becomes much more subsidiary to what is the impact that the company has on all of its stakeholders, whether that's the employees or the communities or the wider environmental impact.
Yeah, I would agree. When I talk to my students about this, they are extremely sensitive to the reputation of companies and brands, and they don't separate out this kind of reporting. They're not looking at financial, or annual reports or companies' investor relations sites. They're getting their information and impressions in other ways, but they clearly choose where they want to get their money, or their prospective employers, and where they want to spend their money based on their impression of, I would say, the sort of ethical character or the ethos of an organization. And they're not necessarily separating out these elements of ESG and specifically, various kinds of targets. But they're looking at as Rajiv said, the character of the organization. And just like they would choose their friends, is this someone that I want to be associated with? Is this a place that I want to support? And so I think while companies and requirements may get down to very specific kind of metrics, I think many stakeholders are more oriented to the general impression and the overall trend and the way that an organization expresses its values and goals.
Before we move on, we do have a comment, which I'll put up on the screen, from Lori Block. Hi, Lori. I haven't heard from Lori in years. We used to work together at Alexander and Alexander Consulting Group in San Francisco. But she says, triple P business, people, planet, profits. And that leads me, I saw that. I immediately went to the screen, and I'll share it. Let's see. Got to pick the right screen. There we go. Not to tout my own organization, but can you all see that? Oh, you're seeing my entire screen, aren't you?
Seeing everything, Michelle.
All right, I got to stop that. Let me see if I can do that again. Sorry about that. All right, share screen. No, it's not going to let me pick one. Oh, there we go. Window. I see. Okay. There it is. This is WebCore. This is the company I work for. And you can see that on our ESG site, which is actually at webcore.com/CSR, they have divided this people, planet, and rather than profit, we say performance, but that's the same idea, governance. I'll stop sharing that now. But what do you think about using people, planet, profit, people, planet, performance as a way to articulate this?
Well, if I can jump in, one of the things I was going to say was that the World Economic Forum tried to put some structure around measuring this stakeholder capitalism that has been referred to by my learned friends, and because it's as broad or as narrow as you choose it to be, and there is something like 600 assessments, well over now. I mean, it's an burgeoning industry here, whereby any corporate can look at any of them and say, yes, well, we're following the guidelines, because there is nothing mandatory currently, and I think that's part of the issue. One of the things that does keep coming up is this issue of people, planet, profit. And with the World Economic Forum, what they added to that, well, the pillars that they have are the principles of governance, planet, people, and prosperity, in an attempt to try and consolidate some of the assessments that were all around the world to get people to simplify what it is that they're presenting. The issue that I have, and it's a huge issue for me, and it kind of sits at the back of all the work that I do, and I very briefly outlined at the beginning, is if you're saying it, how are you proving you're doing it? And to the point that Diane was making, these are the expectations of people coming into organizations. They're the expectations of your customers and suppliers. So therefore, you better be sure that if you are saying you're doing something, that you will be scrutinized for it. Now, this is essentially, an extension of your license to operate, if not your license to operate. And I think in the past, we have let organizations get away with saying one thing and doing another because we haven't actually been challenging enough. We haven't voted with our feet, with our custom. And I think now, to Diane's point, the generations are coming along and saying, well, actually, we're not going to continue to work for you unless you're delivering on what you say you were going to deliver to us as an employee, for instance. But I do think that there is a huge way to go before organizations really get to grips with what all of this means and how it can be good for their business.
Jane, let me stick with you for a minute. The reading I do around this, there's tremendous focus on environment, sustainability. There's an increased focus and a tremendous focus on social purpose. Companies taking stands, the Edelman Trust Barometer being forthright and saying that it is incumbent upon business to resolve social issues because people no longer trust government and NGOs to do that. I don't read so much about governance. Where does the G fit in all of this?
I mean, that's a good question, but I'm not sure that I have the best answer around governance. I think one of the things that I would say about this, and it relates to what my three pals have said earlier, is that this isn't something new. So the problem with the acronym popping up ESG on the back of the SDGs, which was on the back of another three-letter acronym, and et cetera, and CSR, and so it goes on. We don't need to keep reinventing. So organizations have, by and large, been very good at putting in some governance process and systems because regulation around the world has increasingly insisted that they do. Whether or not it's always lived is a whole other kind of circle of fellows discussion. But the governance systems, I think, probably by and large exist. Most organizations have risk management systems, for instance. Most large organizations have an ethics and compliance function. Most organizations have an audit function. These all have fundamental roles. If we're taking ESG and adding it to all of that, then if you're working in a siloed organization, the chances are they're not doing this. And that's what organizations need to do. That takes will and time. So the governance, I don't think, Shell, is anything new. I think it's been treated as something new, but I think people just need to kind of open the kimono a little bit further and they'll find that a lot of these systems already exist and they need to become more interdependent than they are. I don't know what others think.
So transparency, you think? Alice, I know you also have some thoughts on the S&G part of ESG.
Well, let me stick with governance for a minute here, because governance is really the seat of ethics in the organization. It's the expression of ethics. Governance includes how you elect your board, how publicly you discuss your issues, how you handle ethics and compliance concerns within the organization, whistleblowers, all of those kinds of things. And it really, when you start digging into what do you want to report about the ethics of the organization, it comes under governance and it's essential. And you can see major differences between organizations. The social, I think we've talked about social in a little bit of a narrow sense. When I work with organizations on ESG reporting, social goes into things like, how are you creating equitable job market in the areas where you're working? How are you helping to improve education if you're in an area where, particularly where the education level of the region is not up to what you need for your organization's operations? Rather than bringing in expats to run the organization, how are you building up the local skills and those kinds of things? So it really does give you the picture of the organization. And for some types of companies, if you're not a manufacturing company or you are not an energy company, many companies or a construction company, many companies, the environment part is a small piece of what you do. But every company has social and governance issues that they need to look at and examine their performance against.
Yeah, I think that another reason why governance comes into focus is because of the number of scams that we have had, corporate scams all over the world. You have had very large corporates, and they have got away with a lot of wrongdoing, starting from Enron, and then it goes on and on. You have recent cases also, which are very, very prominent. And these brought into attention the real character of these organizations, that most of these organizations where these scams happen have a corporate code of conduct. But how effective is the corporate code of conduct if it doesn't apply to the top management by itself? So that also brought into focus the need. Part of governance is to have not only a strong board, a properly composed board, diversified board, have good independent directors. Most of the independent directors that are placed there in these positions are well known to the promoters and the founders, and they can be manipulated. And the role of independent director is not being done well. And but the regulators in both in the US, Europe, as well as India, are putting into place a lot of processes, a lot of checks and balances to avoid these kind of occurrences in the future. And it is very necessary for every corporate to have a code of conduct, and that should be implemented and embedded into the culture. That is why governance becomes very, very important.
I would say in the nonprofit, NGO, educational sectors, there's a real focus on the composition of boards. I know in higher ed, there's a lot more discussion around who serves on boards. Traditionally, it's people who have the capacity and who have the track record of large donations, and certainly that's necessary. But there's a lot of question about people serving on boards. Do they really understand the mission of, for example, higher education, or are they running it like a corporation? Instead of kind of having the values, ethics, long-term perspective of what higher education is about. What's the diversity of the board? And then who serves on the board? For example, at Ithaca College, we always have a student on the board of trustees, and we always have a faculty member and a staff member. And increasingly, there are more questions about should there be more representation on the board from those constituencies? Again, especially in organizations where there's supposed to be a lot more governance through the stakeholders, particularly faculty and students in organizations. So I think that's that those kind of questions are spreading certainly into the for-profit and corporate sector. Examinations of who serves on the board and what their agenda is and what their perspectives are.
Yeah,
I think that's such a good point, Diane. I think that, and I think there's a direct correlation too with corporate boards around the world, in my view. And I think that if corporate boards are not asking the right questions of the very things that you've outlined, then they automatically are storing up problems for the future. I think that until they start asking the right questions about the, and this is one example, the subject area that we're talking about, it becomes a sort of, there's an entitlement around the boardroom that actually talks the word of stakeholder capitalism, for instance. But really what they're meaning is that that stakeholder is their shareholder, because inevitably they will be shareholders with share options, etc., etc. And I think, there was a really interesting article and piece of research done in 2020 by Lucian Bebchuk, who is he's at Harvard Law School, and I'd urge anybody to read it. It's called The Illusory Promise of Stakeholder Governance, and it makes really interesting reading, but actually plays to the point that you've just been talking about, is the makeup of boards, the conversations that they have, the responsibilities and the personal accountability that they have make a huge difference as to whether or not this area of ESG is a reality, or as we say, greenwash or whitewash.
Yeah, I think the issue of board composition and the inclusion of stakeholders other than shareholders is particularly interesting in light of the decision from the Business Roundtable to expand its definition beyond shareholders. Rajiv mentioned that earlier. Would that extend to something like a professional association? I mean, should IABC's board have a CEO, a chief human resources officer, a chief technology officer, in addition to members on the board?
It's an interesting concept.
And I guess the next question is, if we believe this, not necessarily about IABC, but about boards in general, what leverage does a communicator have to make that case to the powers that be in an organization? And this, this goes beyond the senior leadership of the company.
Well, I think that the fact that we are doing these kinds of reports, the ESG reports, brings the communicators into the discussion. And it's a real opportunity for us as we're working through the items in the report to just say, we really seem to have a gap here. How do we address it? But up front, the first step in doing any kind of ESG reporting is identifying stakeholder interests, stakeholder priorities, and the materiality of what things about your organization are important to stakeholders. And I think when you do that, that's the information that you use to inform the way that you advise the executives.
As long as we're
follow up on that, to say, I think it's we need a different definition and self-image in communications. I think most people think of us as people who take a message that has been or a strategy that's been crafted by the C-suite or the board, and we kind of make it palatable or make it look nice, and we communicate it down and hope that people get it. But actually our role is to build a communication infrastructure that is two ways. And a very important role of communicators is to represent the voice of stakeholders and bring that back to the decision makers, right? So it's the listening role that is often not as emphasized or recognized. And then I also think that we need to see ourselves as partners in the creation of strategy. For example, a lot of my work as a consultant has been helping organizations create a strategic plan, and my role is choosing the various kinds of listening and feedback mechanisms, whether it be in person or online brainstorming or things, to get those voices of various stakeholders and organize it in a way that's convincing and can be understood by other stakeholders. So we're kind of the translators. So I think it really gets down to the definition of our profession, the way that job descriptions are written, the way that we as educators prepare people to go into the field, and to sort of help shape the expectations of those of us who who are reporting to the C-suite, what do our leaders expect us to do?
That's a very good point. Diane has brought out a very good point about the listening aspect. Communication practitioners are basically boundary spanners. They are sitting on the boundary between the organization and the environment, and therefore their job is to basically scan the environment and engage with all the stakeholders in a very transparent and ethical way and very open way, and must recognize the kind of tensions that exist in the stakeholders. And like Diane said, their views ought to be included in the management discourse. And here the communicator can help to bring about positive change. And you see, his position is very, very, very delicate because he has to strive to create a balance between civil society aspirations and the corporate interests. But in this way, a communicator can really help management make the most ethical, humane, and responsible decision in a particular situation and stay in tune with the stakeholder expectations.
I so agree, and I feel as though my head is about to come off my shoulders. I'm nodding so vigorously when Diane started, followed by Rajiv. I've maintained for a long time, and maybe for the four of us who are independent, it's easier because we can be that challenger conscience of an organisation. But I do think it's incumbent on us, and particularly those of us who are involved with the IABC and learn from the IABC and have developed our own careers through the IABC, we have a responsibility, my favourite phrase, Shell, to connect dots. So, you know, as I was talking about before, there are all these different pillars of communication. And to the points that you've just been making, we need to be able, as strategic advisors in an organization or as a business leader, which, by the way, most of the people who come to the IBC World Conference say they are, we should feel confident to be that conscience and to challenge. But we can only challenge if we listen and hear what's going on in the organization and do what we as communicators are so brilliant at, which is network. So we're the ones, as you absolutely say, can point out if we've got variance in the silos of communication, and also say, okay, guys, if you want me to create a clear message for this organization, this is the point at which we all need to sit down and work out what that message is, because I've got four of you in front of me, all with really important roles, but you're saying four different things. So, you know, you can't, and we've seen it in so many organizations that have had ethical failure, where communicators have felt as though they have been forced into communicating in a certain way, which of course is massively corrupting for you as an individual, but also for the organization. And you're just storing up trouble. So I absolutely agree. I think that we should be there as the challenger. We should be there as the conscience of the organization, but as the listener and the getting people to collaborate and create that consistent message. It's really, really key.
We have about 27 minutes left, so I'd like to invite those of you who are watching in real time to contribute your questions, comments, observations, experiences, be part of this, and we'll react to that. We're talking about stakeholders, which I find interesting in the context of the role of the communicator to elevate the voice of the stakeholder. Does that voice have a place in an ESG report? And Alice, I know you do ESG reports, so yeah. I'd like to throw that one to you to start.
Well, absolutely. I've been writing sustainability reports since about 2009, and I just recently got certified through the Global Reporting Institute, which is an organization that promulgates standards for ESG reporting. And one of the things that I learned. It's kind of like if you learn a language by conversation and then you study the grammar, you go, oh, that's the rule behind this. That's the organizing principle. So one of the things that it really emphasized was the need to begin the whole process, not with the data, but with the stakeholders, and to start by saying, what is important to you about what we do? And that's that listening piece. And that begins to set your expectations and your priorities on what you report. I mean, if you are an energy company, you can assume that the emissions that you create or avoid are important, but how does your audience view that versus the importance of the diversity of your leadership? So some of these things, if you're only in the U.S., how does the audience view the importance of your economic development efforts versus if you are operating in a country that is less economically developed? And so you have to start by listening and asking those questions, and then deciding from that what is important. And if you just do that internally and you just ask your own people, you don't really get the truth.
So how does one ask external audiences what's important to them in that context of producing a report that will be meaningful and responsive to their interests and their needs?
Well, I can respond to that and then let somebody else add to it. But the key things are things like community engagement meetings, sending out surveys to shareholders, holding investor gatherings, or doing investor perception studies. Look at the various audiences that are important to you and how do you reach out to them: employees, shareholders, communities, all of these groups, and then political entities as well, government entities.
One of the things that always fascinates me, and I hope some of my colleagues have some advice for me, and it's like, how do you reach out to those who do not have a seat at the table and who may not consider themselves stakeholders? So I'll give you an example. One of the things I'm working on now, I serve on the board of our regional public broadcasting stations, and we're doing the strategic plan. So of course, we have all kinds of devices and ways that we're having focus groups and online brainstorming with employees and donors and listeners and their employees and the board and community leaders. But, especially for a place like an organization like public broadcasting that's supposed to serve everybody in the community, who are the people in the community who are not watching or listening? And why are they not? And why are we not serving them? And this extends to other organizations. Who are customers, potential customers or employees who don't want to engage with the organization? Are there some reasons, and is that something that we should be paying attention to? It's really difficult to figure out how to reach out to those people. And do they matter? No, of course, not everybody matters, but there may be some perceptions or something about an organization that's missing, and it's missing some important voices.
I think to contribute towards creating a proper report, the first thing that companies need to do is to look at that you need to understand your own vulnerabilities and strengths in the ESG space. Companies will need to continually ask themselves, what is my environmental footprint? What is my social footprint? And what is my governance footprint? When you look at the footprints, you are basically identifying your most important material risks, so that you can show to all stakeholders how you are managing the risks and increasing the value creation potential for the long term. Now, there is one part of the report is mandatory data which needs to be disclosed as per the regulators. But today, stakeholders want a lot of non-financial data also, such as risk management, how is the leadership aligned, and how is the governance, what are the policies, what are the codes of conduct, what is the external assurance, what kind of recognition has the company got. And in all this, the role of the communicator is basically to aim for a reputation that shows that the company is well managed in all ESG and economic dimensions, and that it deserves to be recognized for its capabilities and longer term prospects. Communicators, when dealing with stakeholders, will have to educate them also about what are the corporate responsibility issues related to their company. Many times you have to explain to analysts and investors also about your proactive behaviors, why you are behaving in a certain way, what actions and initiatives are you taking, and what is the why behind it. That why is very important. Communicators will also need to, as we discussed earlier, to identify emerging risks and emerging issues and forewarning the management. In that sense, uh, they will have to play a big role and a much stronger role in crisis preparedness in the future.
I think one of the ways to really help management understand the importance of ESG monitoring and reporting is to view it as part of the risk management process, because understanding what those issues are and where your vulnerabilities are, as Rajiv said, is really essential. And ESG reporting helps you do that.
We have a couple of comments that have come in from YouTube, starting with Lori, who Alice, she's asking, what was the certification you referenced?
Oh, well, I got my certificate in case this came up. So the Global Reporting Institute, I don't know if this is actually legible, but the Global Reporting Institute is a group that establishes parameters for reporting. And it basically, there's a checklist that you can download and kind of say what you need to report on. And so, like emissions, you need to report this number, this type of number. And so it's very helpful. But they also have a process for certifying people, and it's a course that you can take online, as well as they do in-person training. And once you complete that course, which is kind of pricey, in my mind, I think it was like $1,500. It's priced in pounds. I think it was about £1,500, which translates into a little bit more in US dollars. And then you get the certificate. And I will tell you, the one thing that I got out of the course that most made a difference for my ability to do a better job, and that is understanding the difference between reporting and goal setting. Because a lot of companies report, well, here's the diversity of our senior management, and by golly, it looks a lot like the diversity did last year. Here are our emissions. Well, they look a lot like what they looked like last year. The thing that we have, I think Rajiv mentioned just in passing, I do like visual aids, the United Nations Sustainability Goals. And the training helped me understand the link between these two things. I thought they were two separate sets of measures, but actually GRI is about what you report, Global Reporting Institute. And the UN sustainability goals are about where you are aiming to improve.
Great. And Lori also is referring us to the certification program at the University of Colorado Boulder for deeper knowledge of corporate social responsibility and ESG. I'll definitely look into that. We also have a comment. It's old friend episode here, because I know Roger from my consulting days when he was with the World Bank. But Roger's asking what guidance to give to communicators who find their own ESG ethics in conflict with their employer. For example, and this was going to be my next question anyway, so thanks for teeing that up, Roger. When corporations greenwash, stay and try and reform, or leave, which may not be a viable option.
Oh, well, I'll give that a go. A brave question, Roger. And I think that just looking at the question, ethics in conflict with an employer, I think you do have a choice to make. If it's an organization you've enjoyed working for and this is emerging, I would always guide anybody, whether they were a communication professional or otherwise, to see if they feel motivated to try and make a difference. But there's only so long you can keep, banging your head against a brick wall, as we might say. And then you make a choice. I think it's a conversation we often have around in organizations that have suffered ethical failure. Well, I thought the values were commensurate with me, but I didn't see them being played out. And yet I've been here for 25 years. What do you think I should do? It's a big choice to make, isn't it? But I do think that you need to be very aware of whether or not you feel you're being corrupted yourself personally, but also whether or not your professionalism is being corrupted, and then make that choice.
Yeah, I think we also need to distinguish with our leadership whether our own ESG ethics are in conflict with the employer because their values are different, or because it's just not on their radar and they haven't put an emphasis on this yet. Agree, disagree?
No, I think this is a good question. And if you look at specifically where my expertise is in the energy industry, they are finding that it's hard to recruit people who don't understand, or who want energy companies basically to go away. So you can't recruit people. Like, I'm not going to go to work for you. You're dirty and nasty.
Right.
So, but if you are an energy company, no matter how green your ambitions, it's not an immediate change. And so if you're in a company that has the potential to change and you see them working toward that, then you stay and you become part of that. And it's the same for people coming in as engineers to a company. If the company's values and direction are something you can support, then that's a place you want to be.
So the case that you could make as a communicator is that you need to be focused on this because your recruiting goals are falling behind. We know how important that is. And if you would like to be able to recruit in the future and even retain high-performing employees, it's important to start to emphasize this. Would that be consistent with what you were saying, Alice?
It's important to emphasize it in your communications, but also in your strategy and your daily actions.
I want to focus on this idea of greenwashing for a few minutes, because it's hardly a new concept. Organizations have been putting a lipstick on the environmental pig for decades. And my question is greenwashing translating over into the social and governance side of things? As these gain prominence, are there organizations that are trying to make those things look good when they're not actually taking the kind of action that would be required to make substantive progress?
I think it goes back to what Jane was saying is, so what is the progress towards goals? A company can look like they're not doing a great job in emissions or whatever, but if you can see their progress, and if the reporting includes something like past year's statistics and particular goals, then I think we can better determine what is greenwashing and what is just kind of progress that may be slow, but it's still necessary, and they're sincerely trying. But I think in many organizations, and I think it's more on the advertising side, there are kinds of blurbs or even packaging or things that make something look like it's environmentally friendly when in fact it's not.
One of the case studies that I'm thinking of, and it's recent and it's in the news, involves Spotify. The streaming music and podcast service paid $100 million to bring Joe Rogan's podcast exclusively to Spotify. Rogan initially took some criticism when Neil Young asked to have his music removed because of Rogan's stance on, or the kind of publicity he gave to anti-vaxxing and anti-masking. But then he also had an episode, he's had many, but one was recent that was sort of blatantly racist. And the response of Spotify was to donate $100 million to ensure that communities that are underrepresented have the opportunity to develop their own podcast to share their point of views. And he came in for heavy criticism, the CEO of Spotify, for that donation as a sort of social form of greenwashing, because it doesn't address the core issue of having this exclusive, highly rated podcaster continue to have a platform for making the statements he did. So I guess I'm asking at this level, in response to issues that arise, how do you determine that your response is one that is going to satisfy the expectations and the demands of the public?
I think that's such a brilliant example.
Right.
Oh, sorry, Rajiv. I'll be very brief. I think it's such a great example of a company responding with a knee-jerk reaction in an old traditional way. Was, let's just throw some money at it, and then that kind of puts our marker in the sand. That's what we stand for. They haven't really proven it by helping to do what they say they're doing. And I think that the scrutiny nowadays is such that they came in for heavy criticism. It's a perfect example of why you can't do that these days. Rajiv, sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you.
Right. So I think that when you talk of greenwashing, primarily the communicators have to ensure a lot of transparency and authenticity in their outreach to all stakeholders. Because today the level of activism is very high. There are a lot of activists, there are investor activists, there are shareholder activists, there are a whole lot of regulators who are looking at you and watching you carefully, and will pounce on the very first evidence of greenwashing, and they will name and shame you. Any defaulting organization will be named and shamed. So when we talk of talk and action, primarily talk and action should be intertwined like a strands of a rope, and it is the communication practitioner's job to see and underscore that the ethical and legal behavior is, within an organization, is complied with. And like Diane said, many times the creative agencies, the ad agencies, or the PR agencies tend to overstep their brief, and on the grounds of creativity they may misrepresent the organization also. So you have to see, where does the fault lie? Does the fault lie in communication, or does the fault lie in the action being taken by the organization? Today even the PR agencies have actually uh, they are worried, because sometimes they have been accused of kind of misrepresenting clients. And one of the agencies, Edelman, has ensured that it will not misrepresent the organizations whom it represents in fossil fuels. Similarly, WPP also has actually said that it is one of the emerging risks it faces the WPP itself faces an increased reputational risk associated with working on environmentally detrimental client briefs and or misrepresenting environmental claims. So these pressures are everywhere, and you have to be very, very careful that if you want to maintain your reputation and you don't want to avoid shareholder skepticism, you have to be very, very careful in what you report and what you state. And this should be actually corresponding to the truth and nothing beyond the truth.
I think that another piece of that is it's sort of an unintentional greenwashing, which is you want to tell the story in the way that is most favorable to you. And you go, well, that makes sense. But one of the standards within ESG reporting is that you report where you have fallen short of your goals or of the external standards. And so you include where have you in the energy industry, where have you had spills, where have you had unintentional emissions, where have you had social failures, where you've had protests or things like that. And companies, leaders are so trained to tell the good news that there's a lot of pushback when it comes to reporting these pieces. And it's not intentional greenwashing. It's, well, we don't want to air the dirty laundry. And there's an education process to help managements understand the difference.
We have a comment and another question and about 3.5 minutes to get to them. So the comment from Lori points out that greenwashing and whitewashing is rife within the DEI space, and she points to hiring practices and pay equity as examples. From Mirko Petricevic, after George Floyd's death, a coalition called on corporations to suspend advertising on Facebook, arguing that Facebook allowed extremism to flourish. Any thoughts on advising clients to stop using a tool like Facebook advertising that has delivered such great returns for them?
My immediate thought on that is it's the same as, do you stay with a company where your ethics and theirs don't line up, or where your ESG values and theirs don't line up? It's, do you stay and be part of changing it, or do you leave?
And I just add to that, I agree 100%. And the question you have to ask is whether you can change it.
Right. Well, I do, with a couple of minutes left, want to make sure that everybody knows what's coming up on the next episode of Circle of Fellows. Episode 79 will take place on Thursday, March 17th. We're going back to noon Eastern time for this one. Thanks everybody for shifting schedules, because it's late in India, right? We didn't want to keep Rajiv up too late. And we do enjoy the international nature of these broadcasts. But returning to our regular schedule of noon Eastern time on March 17th, the topic is communication strategy and stakeholder engagement, something I thought we delved into nicely today. So we'll expand on that beyond the scope of just ESG. The panelists in that episode will be George McGrath, Martha Muzichka, Letitia Narvaez, and Brad Whitworth. So I'm looking forward to that one. And I see we still have a minute and a half left. So I'll take that minute and a half and throw a question to you, Diane. Where does ESG fit in terms of the larger issue of reputation, and how do you make it fit in the efforts that you're undertaking to improve and maintain an organization's reputation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, because I think it's really relevant to, especially my role in preparing the next generation of communication professionals, and then trying to translate that out to practitioners and help them in their professional development. I look at it in two ways. One is that ESG As Rajiv pointed out, and others have pointed out, there are lots of acronyms. They change all the time. Regulations change. What is hot and and in vogue in business magazines and big consulting organizations changes over time. So I think it's important for us to kind of step back and take the longer view. And I do think it's reputation. A lot of my work is in trying to understand how intangible assets get reported and how communicators are actually the folks who build those intangible assets in organizations. And the research shows very clearly now that the stock price of most organizations is substantially made up by perception, reputation, and those kinds of intangible assets. So I think it's important for us to have that sort of business head. And while we do need to pay attention to regulations and changing kinds of vocabulary, I think we need to understand, and our partners need to understand, that that's what we do.
Great. And that takes us to the end of this episode. Thanks, everybody, for a stimulating conversation. Look forward to seeing you all in New York for the IABC World Conference coming up end of June. Bye-bye, all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.